Welcome to WEI Tech Talk. My name is Seamus Ware. I am a strategist for our managed services and X as a service business. Myself and Matt are going to have a great conversation around kind of GreenLake and what that brings to the table, kind of break down some of the walls as well as some of the confusion around it.
So I'm Matt Leal. I'm a pre-sales solutions architect here at WEI. I've been with WEI for almost 2 years now. Prior to that, I was a HPE employee, so I was a compute solutions architect over there, focusing mainly on data center compute solutions. But I've seen my fair share of GreenLake opportunities. I've sold GreenLake to a number of different customers and have a good sense of where GreenLake's come from, how it's evolved over the years, and some of the practical challenges and some of the benefits you've seen firsthand.
Yeah, same. Like you, I was at HP for quite a while, about 13 years. Started out just on the floor, supporting customers as kind of like a customer success type manager. Got really good at escalations, went into escalation management, and around the time HP split into multiple companies, they decided to split off the part of their business that did managed services. That was called HP Enterprise Services. Now it's called DXC as a company. Mm-hmm. At that time, I was brought in kind of as an escalation to help. There was another team called Operational Support Services. They brought them in to help with kind of building a new managed service. Went from 4 customers to 400, it felt like, overnight. And I just stuck with it. I really loved that job. I really got the concept of managed services. It was the first time since I'd been in the service industry where I actually felt like we were doing more than just providing boxes to people, right? We were actually helping with the full management of that solution. And so to me, I just love managed services. I love the concept of it. So.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about managed services here today.
Oh, yeah.
But just sort of to set the playing field, this is sort of going to be like an introductory course. Think of like a 100 level course,
yeah, of course.
on GreenLake, hoping to sort of set a baseline, set a sort of a foundation of understanding for our listeners, so they can better understand what GreenLake is. And I think
it's a good place to start. I mean, I guess since you brought it up, let's just start there, right?
Absolutely.
So, well, why don't you say what you think GreenLake is,
Sure.
And if I can add color to it, I will. We'll just go through it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we in preparing for this podcast, something that you brought up and something that really resonated with me is sort of that analogy of sort of the 4 wheels or 4 pillars or whatever you want to use. And the way I see GreenLake is it's first and foremost it's a financial model, but that's only one of the components, right?
Sure.
There's also the managed services piece. There's the advisory and professional services that are part of it as well. And then there's what's the 4th?
It's like critical services. So HPE has different like tech care, complete care. Complete care used to be called data center care, and they kind of made it something different. Essentially, it's just what's called a mission critical level support inside the environment. So essentially, any GreenLake customer actually gets that as a standard. It's not peeled off. It's actually just part of GreenLake in general.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah.
So ultimately, when I think of GreenLake, it's a lot of it's around that financial model. It's being able to deliver outcomes as a service, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if we remember right, what HP did when they created GreenLake was really just gave customers a new way of buying technology, right? And so we talk about OPEX versus CAPEX, which we'll get into later a little bit. The goal was to essentially give our customers the ability to utilize the architecture without actually having to own it, right? So many different benefits that come from that. But primarily just the new financial model. And because they have a massive bank behind them, being HPE Financial Services, they're able to do it all themselves. It's not like, so some of the competitors like Dell, Lenovo, some others use like created leases to do what they're doing, where HPE is literally just funding the financing of its architecture. So.
Yeah, if you look at some of the marketing material from HPE, one of the things you'll see a lot is the hybrid cloud that comes to you.
Yeah, sure.
And you'll also hear hybrid by design, right?
Yes.
So I think what's important for anyone who wants to understand GreenLake is understanding what's meant by hybrid cloud and private cloud and sort of having a definition for those things.
Yeah, I think it's important. And in fact, I think sometimes we even get confused when we're having the conversation because we're having conversations with customers who have their own understanding of that particular concept.
Mhm.
And so I think just to kind of define it, a hybrid cloud is an environment that's mixed generally, right?
Mhm.
So there'll be an on-prem solution with a stack of workloads that exist there across multiple different technologies. Generally, it could be in a customer's location, it could be in a co-location as far as data centers go. But then there's also the embedded mix of the cloud that comes into that, right? So
Mhm.
AWS, Google, Amazon, right? Or Azure, that they all kind of come together and blend. And so that hybrid environment could be also a multi-cloud environment, right? It
Mhm.
could be the private cloud on-prem mixed with multiple cloud providers, kind of to create that hybrid environment.
Yeah, and when HPE says hybrid by design, right? What they're really talking about is, if you talk to a customer these days, they're obviously doing something with the cloud, right?
Sure.
But they're
Yeah, you're
also
right.
they're also still supporting legacy applications that are most likely
Yeah.
kept on premises, and they've gotten to that point sort of organically and not in an organized fashion or a lot of organizations are adopting that cloud first strategy. All their new applications are going to be
Right.
deployed in the cloud, and a lot of stuff is left on prem. Um, HPE's been evangelizing, hybrid by design rather than, adopting a cloud first strategy, and over the
Right.
years, ending up in a hybrid cloud scenario. Starting that hybrid cloud journey at the beginning with sort of a set design plan for, where your applications are going to live, and
Yeah.
and and spinning them up in the most cost effective way and in
Yeah,
a
they
way
call
that
it
makes
cloud
sense.
smart instead
Hmm.
of cloud first, right? At the
Hmm.
end. So to your point, there's some IDC studies that HP's come out with that show kind of this bimodal scenario that exists for HPE, right? Where they, to your point, they're not saying that cloud first strategy isn't a bad strategy. What they're saying is you should be very explicit about the things that you put in the cloud because it can be very expensive. Especially imagine, putting workloads that constantly need to send data in and out of the cloud. Well, maybe you've supplanted a little bit the cost of the architecture, and maybe by going to the cloud, and now you have endless capacity, right? But that comes at a cost, right? That one, the capacity cost, and two, um, the the data ingress and egress is really expensive in some of these cloud providers right
Hmm.
now. Most of them have kind of moved to an ingress is we don't charge you for. It's when you want to get your data back out. So that's like that data gravity scenario and that tidal lock of your data. And so a lot of customers will struggle with that a little bit on that particular part. But I think the other thing is, I think those IDC studies show that only about 70% of legacy applications are even ready to go to the cloud. I think from containerization perspective, they might be monolithic in their data pools, right? They might not have the ability to just lift and shift. There might be some kind of regulatory reason like HIPAA or PCI or something that would prevent them from going to the cloud. And so that's why most of our customers end up having a hybrid scenario,
Hmm.
right? Things that can't go have to stay, the things that can do, right?
Hmm.
It just makes sense. So,
And one thing you mentioned there, data gravity is often talked about when we talk about GreenLake. Because I think
yeah,
if we step aside and move away from the centralized data center model and think of more services at the edge,
sure.
too. Bringing things like AI and inference to the edge, bringing compute where the data is being collected.
Right.
Something you can't necessarily do with the cloud, right? Because it's still that centralized model where with GreenLake you can still have the same OPEX and cloud operating model, while still deploying services at the edge.
No, absolutely right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that it gets into the point of earlier you kind of brought up everything on the truck, right? And when we're talking, and when we read about what I really meant by that is, when you define a private cloud, right? And that's what HP primarily can provide is your private cloud experience, right? When you do that, you have to decide how you're going to do that. The first thing they did was the financial model we talked about, right?
Mhm.
Taking CAPEX, turning it into OPEX, right? The second thing they did was start to tie services around it to where now, yeah, okay, I've given you the architecture. You no longer own that architecture. What's the next thing we're going to do? Well, we're going to add people, processes, and tools to that architecture. So now you get it as a service to you, as opposed to you having to do all of the carrying and feeding of the environment. We're going to tie these services to it.
Mhm.
The next thing they started to do was build on the cloud concept of start going deeper into the stack. And so no longer is it just an IaaS play that's being managed for you as an option, right?
Mhm.
Now it can be a VMAS, it can be database as a service. It can be, I mean, you name it, backup as a service, whatever that happens to be, provided to you in the same way. And so they're going deeper into the stack. And if you think about it, while HP is selling a ton of architecture, they're actually supporting a lot of non-HP architecture or software and products, right? And so that's where kind of GreenLake starts to really become a true cloud. Is, now you don't own the architecture, now you don't own the resources to maintain those layers like you wouldn't in Amazon, right? Now you also have all of these options for cloud-like services, right? Those things, X as a service type scenarios. And then what really cool thing they did is they created some strategic partnerships with like Equinix and Cirrus One and Digital Realty and some of these companies, so that they can also provide on the same line item bill pre-negotiated rates for colo, right? So now they don't have to own the data center anymore. So customers can just go focus on their business and what they do, right? If I'm a major healthcare provider down in Texas, right, and I want to provide all these, these different services, right? Maybe I want to build an AI platform, right? And that AI platform is going to be pretty expensive, right? Not just in the obtaining of the AI platform, but also in the maintaining of the AI platform. And so these companies are starting to get out of the business of maintaining their own architecture. That's why sometimes the cloud is so provocative, is they don't have to invest in the people, process, and tools to maintain the layers that they don't see value or that they just utilize, right?
And it's all about that cloud experience,
it
right?
Is.
And that's ultimately what GreenLake's aiming to deliver. And let's maybe unbox that a little bit, right? Like, what do we mean when we say cloud experience? We've kind of said that a few times.
Yeah, I from my perspective, and I'm really interested to hear yours, because I know you're on the other side of it from the technology perspective. But from my perspective, it's kind of like what I was saying earlier, right? If I'm a healthcare company and I'm creating that AI solution, I want to be able to utilize it without having to maintain it, and I want to invest in things that, like, if I want to invest in like resources that are like data scientists as opposed to people who are maintaining architecture. So the first thing you do when you go to the cloud is you do lift off your shoulders kind of that piece, right? But the cloud-like experience to me is if you can utilize it like AWS, right? If you can land your architecture or land your stuff, there's a lot of self-service capability, automation, orchestration, that stuff that comes in. If I want to click a button, spin up a VM, if there's cloud-like economics behind it, meaning every VM has tied, if it costs this much per VM, and I can do that show back and charge back internally from my organization. I mean, it obviously go a lot deeper than that, but ultimately, I think the experience is, I no longer feel like I'm maintaining a data center. I feel like I'm utilizing this outcome or this solution to produce my outcome. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would reiterate sort of the three things you just mentioned. Like, it's the cloud economics, right? It's the pay-as-you-go model. It's having capacity available at hand. You're not waiting
on demand
on lead times.
Yep.
And then you mentioned it as well, is that automation and that self-service capabilities. Being able to say, I need to stand up a VM today, and just going out and doing it, right? You're not waiting for additional capacity to be added to your environment.
So let's double click on that one too. So capacity on demand, right? Previously, but when when GreenLake was, what was it called before? It was
flex capacity.
Flex capacity, right? Essentially, what you would do is they would give you architecture, they would give you a bit of variable capacity, and you would pay for it. You'd order more when you needed it, kind of thing. They went and bought a company called Cloud Cruiser and a few others, right? They gave them the ability to start metering at the at the compute unit level, storage unit level, that kind of stuff, right? And so that metering capability allows them to get ahead of capacity on demand, and they really do have a true capacity on demand scenario now. So traditionally in flex cap, and then even before that, just in a traditional purchase, customer decides when they need it, they fully invest it right up front, they buy it, and it comes, and they have all this capacity that they're using, and we really rely on them before to tell us when they need more, right? Really cool thing about what GreenLake's doing in their metering capability is, just like the cloud, are able to show a customer when they're consuming, how they're consuming, and even if they have peaks up into the variable capacity that have been provided, if it's not consistent, there's no need to add more capacity. Or the better way of saying it is more right-sized to their workload. And from that perspective, while they're being metered, their customer success manager on the HP side will see it. They'll have frequent meetings with them about it, and they can actually order a little ahead of need, so it feels like based upon real data that they're actually getting capacity when they're supposed to be.
Mhm.
Right. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the whole model behind the cloud economics, right? It's different from a traditional lease where
right.
you are paying on a monthly basis, but it's tied closer to the resource utilization rather than just a fixed cost, right? So I use the analogy sometimes of think of a lease on a car, right? You pay a monthly fee, you pay some service fees on top of that, but it's different from the cloud model with GreenLake, or the OPEX model with GreenLake. What it would be more like is if you got you pay per mile, right? Is more of a better analogy as to what
True.
it's like.
Yeah. More like an Uber or Lyft scenario as opposed
Right.
to yeah, absolutely.
Or if you rent like a U-Haul or something like that, you pay per mile.
There you go. That's a good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit how GreenLake works, right?
Sure.
Especially from that cloud economics and operational expenditure perspective. So traditional IT purchases, right? You make a large upfront investment, you sweat that asset, you depreciate it over its useful life, and something sort of important with that is, with the end of Moore's law, it's not like technology has stopped advancing at a rapid pace, right?
Right.
Technology
Right.
is with AI and other technologies, it's continuing to
Sure.
accelerate.
Sure.
So that useful life of IT assets is getting shorter and shorter. So it's becoming less of an attractive option for IT buyers to go with a capital expenditure. It makes more sense to move to an operational expense model.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
To your point, the cloud pretty much stays up to date. Endless
Mhm.
capacity makes it easier, but there are certain things coming out technology-wise, like chipsets for NVIDIA and some of
Mhm.
these other things that are really creating a new type of supercomputing, right?
Mhm.
Um, but to a point you were making, you start that traditional purchase, you get it up front. You utilize maybe this much of it because on your cycle of 3 to 5 years, or maybe even longer from a refresh perspective, you're going to need this much architecture eventually. And maybe it takes you 18 months to 22 years to even start really utilizing this thing you've invested in. And so that right sizing of the environment from that traditional CAPEX purchase to the OPEX purchase that exists today is now we're going to look at what your actual utilization is. We're going to take because you think about it, even when a customer decides to take on a new technology, they generally don't keep every virtual machine they have or every database they have, right? They tend to modernize, consolidate, that kind of thing. And to your point about technology advancing, as we get further down the line in the technology history, right? New technology tends to handle better or more on
On a smaller footprint. Yeah, you can
right,
do more
right,
with
right,
less. Yeah.
right. You do a lot more with less, and so for that reason, it makes sense to from an economics perspective, to start with what you think you're going to need for the next, maybe not 5 years, but maybe for the next 12 months,
Mhm.
right? Then you add, so that'll be what HP creates is like an 80% capacity, right?
Mhm.
And that's 100% of what's going to be needed for what you believe that portion is, right? And then from there, they add 20% on top, and they do like kind of an 80-20, where your committed capacity is 80, 20% is variable.
Mhm.
They give you a rate for that variable capacity and a tiered. The more you consume, the better it costs, right? And it really aligns to the customer strategy of a refresh cycle. That traditional purchase, because you're like you mentioned, you have to sweat that asset, and a lot of times that major upfront investment is a hard sell to do, right? And so it creates a behavior within our customers where they don't want to keep going back to the trough every 5 years asking for this massive investment. In fact, I think they probably stress about it from the moment they get it to the next 5 years, how they're going to do it again, right? And so in that scenario, this really does solve that problem, right?
Mhm.
It allows them to get capacity that is right-sized for their environment. It's a variable capacity. It turns it into operational expenditures. And it's easier to go back to the trough and say, hey, here's our justified utilization, right? I'm actually using this thing I'm investing in. And by the way, now I have an argument because we're using it more to add capacity. And it's already an easy change order. It's a much different experience, right?
And like we talked about earlier, one of the fundamental concepts of a cloud operating model is having that capacity on demand, and that's
Sure.
that 20% buffer that
Absolutely.
you mentioned, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
there, it's on the floor, it's in your data center,
Don't
and
use it unless you use
you're
it.
not being charged for it unless you start to turn it on.
Exactly.
And there's a couple of different ways that HPE meters, right? That reserve capacity or
Yeah.
the capacity in general, right? There's a couple of what they call a unit of measure.
Right.
One of them, you mentioned a few of them earlier, was a compute unit, which really just boils down to the amount of memory that you're using in a server, minus some overhead for things like
Right.
virtualization, hypervisor, those sorts of things. But you also have you can be measured in gigabytes for a storage array, or you could be sort of an off-on, right? In certain scenarios, it makes sense where if you have a large array of servers, you're only charged for the ones that you've turned on.
Yeah.
At any given time.
Yeah.
And running workloads.
And I mean,
on.
and mileage there can vary, right? So they could decide 80/20 is pretty much their standard. They could decide they need more capacity, more variable capacity, because like say you're a retail customer, right? So as a retail customer, obviously in the middle of spring or in the middle of at the end of the year during Christmas time and all that kind of stuff, you're going to have these spikes in utilization of your environment as a whole. But on the downswing to that, you probably don't, right? And so at the end of the day, the need to utilize additional capacity is seasonal for them, and so it makes more sense to then have more variable capacity, right? Or say you got a backup solution or a DR solution. Well, that DR solution can be hot or cold or active passive or active, right? However you've chosen that. And that also might dictate the need for more variable capacity on one side because it's almost never utilized than the other. But the cool thing is they're very flexible that way, and being able to pick the kind of right solution for the customer's use case, right?
Right.
So,
But for customers that are going to experience steady growth over a 5-year period,
sure.
You mentioned it earlier. With GreenLake, you have a dedicated CSM, a customer success manager,
Right.
who's going to be there
Right.
and go over with you, your current utilization, your utilization trends, and making sure that you're staying ahead of any demand that might come in the future. Even if you don't see, a trend in demand on the GreenLake console, where you can actually
Sure.
visually see that the increase in capacity utilization. In speaking with them, if there's major projects coming down the pipeline where you're going to need, a lot more resources, you have the ability to do that.
Right. And the kind of point I was making earlier about the seasonal piece, right? That CSM, their job is to recognize these spikes into the variable capacity. And when it's consistently doing it, right, the customer's now paying more than they should. And so it actually makes more sense for them to add additional capacity and variable capacity because one, they get a better cost per compute unit. Because you talk about compute unit, well, the compute unit, storage unit, those have a cost associated with them that includes all of the services and everything that's there. And so the more they consume, the better that cost gets generally.
Right. Yeah. And something that is kind of interesting. I saw something recently that at HPE had released that they officially are now supporting tiering for all GreenLake customers, which wasn't something that was generally available, which was something I wasn't even aware of that. But in the couple of GreenLake opportunities I've been involved with, it's always been, sort of a tiered model. But I guess that wasn't sort of a standard offering until just recently.
I think it was standard. I think every use case is different, right? I had a very large bank that we supported when I was there, and I mean, they probably spend $50 million in storage, right? So you can imagine that growth is massive and consistent. They had over, I think, like 400 petabytes of data in this thing. It was huge as an object storage solution. So you can imagine the growth there is huge, and the tiering process for them is very different because at the end of the day, they're consuming a massive amount, right? Well, then you flip that to a customer that's maybe got a couple storage arrays, right? And they're probably not going to grow too much. It doesn't make sense to give them a tiered model because at the end of the day, they're never going to utilize a tiered model, right? So I think that's probably why we saw a lot of that. But I think HPE is an effort to get back to being more cloud-like is really, I think, doubling down on that tiered approach, which is awesome.
Yeah,
it just makes it easier for us to sell it. So.
And just so the audience is clear, what we're talking about is, as you increase the resources on the floor, your monthly bill or your rate for your unit of measure will go down as you
the more you consume, the more you save.
Yeah, it's a volume discount essentially at the end of the day.
And the cool thing they were doing before in the tiering, and I have to go figure out if anything's changed there, but is when you were consuming and you say your first tier is this amount of capacity, and the moment you go into over that capacity, now you're in that next tier, right? Which then comes with 2 units of cost that are different from each other. It's not what they were doing before. Is it wasn't just Now that you're in this second tier, everything that you're utilizing with that's over the first tier is now at this new rate. They actually then extend that rate across back, right? So everything now is that second tier. Everything now is that third tier rate, which is incredible.
Yeah. So, do we want to talk a little bit about some of the canned offerings that GreenLake has? So some of the as a service models that they offer.
Yeah.
So some of the ones that I think probably most people are familiar with are things like infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and all the way up to software as a service.
So maybe we define those a little bit. So,
sure.
So infrastructure as a service, meaning I no longer as a customer have to own the architecture. The vendor I'm going to, in this case HPE, is going to provide me that as an OPEX spend, and they're going to provide that to me as a service, meaning just like we got done talking about with the capacity piece, it's all off of the customer's ownership. When we get into PaaS, PaaS is a little different. Now we're talking about outcome-driven scenarios, right, where it's platform as a service. So for instance, VMAS or DRAS or DR as a service or VM as a service. And you could even, and that is so much complexity, right? It could just be simply, I've given you this stack of architecture that also has a hypervisor, that also has VMs on it, and you can call that virtualization as a service. If you're not managing through the OS, you can call that VM as a service. If you are managing through the OS, or even just giving them the ability to maybe click a button, spin up a VM, that kind of thing, right? So platform really becomes huge. And then software as a service, HPE has invested in certain companies, and I'll just give a couple as an example. Morpheus, so huge acquisition that just came up this year, right? Brad Park and his team are incredible. For a company that only had about 200 people, they had about 55% of the market share when it came to orchestration of automated scripting, right? And they took everything, Python, Ansible, AWX, whatever, right? All of these different scripting tools, and they gave the customer that exact ability to click a button, spin up a VMs. What I thought was really cool was the other things that it also orchestrates, like essentially it creates a marketplace for the customer where they can go and deploy services. If they want to deploy, name something, DHCP within the environment or something, they have the ability to click and do that, where it's just more than just spinning up a VM in that point, like
it makes it easy. It's almost like a self-service catalog. So,
exactly.
So even if you're not directly involved in IT, you can still be involved in a certain business unit when you need resources, need to spin up things. Right. What IT can do is they can build sort of a framework or a guideline around what you're allowed to spin up, and they can put a limit on the resources.
Sure.
But it gives the user the ability to freely spin up an environment from a very easy interface.
Right. So it goes back to that cloud-like experience we were talking about, right? Everything we can do to lift off of the customer's shoulders the heavy lift of workload creation and maintenance allows them to spend more time healing patients, selling products, doing the job that they specialize in, because we're now providing that stuff to them as a service.
So would you say the main difference between IaaS, SaaS, and platform as a service is really it's the level of managed services, right?
I think I'm a little biased because I kind of lead managed services, right, sales. But at the end of the day, and I help build one. So my opinion is yes. My opinion is you really, in my opinion, don't create a cloud-like experience if you're not managing the layers that the cloud would. When I go to AWS, I don't get to touch the architecture, right? I land workloads on an environment that they've provided me from a capacity perspective. But I'm not choosing which server. I'm not choosing which storage. I'm not choosing which networking, firewall, blah, 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 right? I'm only deploying workloads, right? VDI, containers. When we create a cloud-like experience at HPE, my opinion's always been, unless you're providing more of those wheels on the truck that we talked about, right, you're really not providing a cloud-like experience. And so the cool thing they've done is they've really given the customer the ability to be flexible there, right? You might say you want a cloud-like experience, but as a customer, maybe what that means to you is you just want the ability to not have to capitalize your investment anymore. Or you may truly want the ability to set it, forget it, have a solution that works for you like a cloud, have the self-service capability, just like you would in the cloud, treat it like we're in the cloud, because the other option might be, well, I can't go there. As much as I want to go to the cloud, I can't, but I still want that experience, right? So to answer your question in a very long way, yes, I think managed services is required
Yeah, it's
Right.
it's that racy, right? It's like how far up the stack you're willing to give up the responsibilities for.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's
yeah, and
at the infrastructure level or all the way up to
exactly.
the software stack.
So that was going to be my second point that you had asked. Yes, I think infrastructure as a service, PaaS, CaaS, whatever you want to call it, what goes into those service offerings that's different is just how deep in the stack you're providing as a solution, because we might only be providing the architecture, somebody else might be providing, Red Hat might come in and provide a container solution that's just sitting on top of our architecture that they maintain, right?
Mhm.
So part of it might be how much of that are we doing. At the end of the day, the outcome to the customer is the same, right? Having that flexibility, go from IaaS to PaaS, I think is huge.
Mhm.
So
And-
HP actually refers to as X as a service, right?
Right.
X as a service being literally anything we sell, we can give it to you now in GreenLake as a service, right?
Yeah, and that I mean that's pretty open ended. It can be
Right.
difficult to kind of
It's hard for us to define, right? We're experts.
Right.
So, yeah.
But there are also sort of canned solutions, like predefined solutions that are as a service that fit into that
Good point.
X as a service
Yeah,
model,
good
like
point.
things like disaster recovery as a service, which is a little bit more specific, right?
Yeah.
Things like file and block as a service, or HPE GreenLake for file. You've mentioned VM as a service. What we call that in HPE is private cloud for business enterprise.
Right. Or private cloud enterprise, right? Either one of those,
Yeah.
right? One is kind of competes with like VxRail, some of the others, right? In the BE scenario, private cloud business enterprise, and then the private cloud enterprise are also canned all the way through the VM as well, right? That one includes managed services automatically, the other one doesn't. HP used to have another product, or they still do, called SimpliVity, and they also worked out a product with Nutanix where it's a pre-build compute and hypervisor preloaded on it already, so they've really done it multiple ways, right?
Yeah,
So
not to mention HPE's own virtualization platform, right?
Yes.
HPE's VM Essentials, which is
Yeah.
slated to be part of that PCB solution.
And then Discover this year, or I guess now last year, they started to express. Some of us were brought in, because we're a platinum partner, we get access to certain types of information at HPE that other partners don't, because we're leading edge partners in that way. We're selling a ton to our customers of HPE, and so we kind of get brought in on some of the stuff they're thinking about doing or they're about to do, right? One of those is HPE's coming out with their own hypervisor, right? So they're going to be doing virtualization on their own. I think they're kind of tired. I don't know if they're tired, but I think they're a technology company that can do it. And I think they're seeing value in not having to constantly have this cyclical Broadcom scenario or name your hypervisor scenario where they're battling not being able to sell their products because these other products are these linchpin products that you just can't do without. And so,
yeah, and one of the biggest fears for people looking to get away from VMware is like, oh gosh, how am I going to manage it? VMware is all
True.
I know. But if we're looking at GreenLake and you're looking at a sort of a more managed, as a service model, does it really matter what the underlying hypervisor is?
Agreed. And they kind of already stepped down that road, right? When they bought the Esmeralda platform, right? It's a Kubernetes underpinning and a bunch of stuff they got from Blue Data and some of these other companies, right? When they bought and created the container as a service type solution, they started to go down the pathway of just that, right? The SaaS kind of provider of full stack solutions as opposed to, just providing architecture. If you think about it, customers have always had to just worry about, I'm going to get my architecture from them, I'm going to get my hypervisor from them, I'm going to get my containerization from them, and it's always a little disjointed. And somebody, which is good for us, is like we at WEI specialize very heavily in we'll call day one services stuff, right? So the build, deploy, migrate, design, all that kind of stuff to help them get this kind of hodgepodge of stuff together to create a true outcome and solution. HP does a good job at that as well. They have a great professional services piece, which we've kind of talked about a little bit. But that's where the partnership really comes in. The cool thing for us is, because we're also that platinum partner, we can go in under HPE SKUs and it'll look like HP selling their professional services, but because we're so good at it, it actually ends up being us to do the job. So so it's a really good compromise for our customers, right? They come to us because they trust us. We have the relationship at WEI. That's why HPE finds us valuable as partners, right? Where HPE might pivot a salesperson from one account to the next, our guys get it and they stay forever, right? And so that's where a customer wants that kind of that
Continuity.
relationship, which is, I think, one of the most valuable things we bring. But on top of that, we bring those types of services that make us really, really valuable to HPE and to the customer. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, when you have the same people, worrying about the architecture and design, doing the implementation, and then doing the handoff to a managed service provider as well. Oftentimes you find that the people that set up environment, kind of just
Sure.
wipe their hands of it. And then managed services comes in and
Yeah.
is like, okay, what's going on here? Like
Right.
with WEI's partnership with HPE, because we're involved in every step of the way up and until the managed services. We have that graceful handoff, and it's just a smoother
100%.
transition.
Yeah, it makes it when it's a platinum or a partner in general who's driving that build, design, deploy, professional services type engagement. They care a lot about that customer because that's who owns the relation. We're who owns the relationship. We care a lot about them, and so it's not just like a normal everyday project that somebody, I got a new customer, got a new project. Let's go tackle it. For us, it ends up being a little personal because at the end of the day, we care about these customers, and we've spent a lot of time cultivating the trust with them. And I think HP would agree. And sometimes when we're the ones doing the handoff, they get a different experience in managed services as the day two team who now has to take this thing and run with it than sometimes they get otherwise, right? So, and every partner's different, right? Mileage varies for sure on capabilities and attention to detail, that kind of stuff. So, all right. Matt, it was great talking today. Really appreciate you coming and do this with me. It's been a cool experience. It's nice, leaving HPE, coming to WEI as a to become part of the partner community, to have somebody that understands what I'm talking about, that can partner with me to help our customers and our internal team kind of get there with GreenLake. We broke down kind of everything, right? We talked about what GreenLake was. We talked about the cloud-like experience and the motivations for our customers to go utilize it. We talked about the financial models. We talked about the as-a-service business as a whole. Is there anything you think of that we missed, maybe?
No, I think that's a good way to wrap it.
All right. So if our customers want to know more about where to find more information about either GreenLake or WEI, they can reach us at our LinkedIn page. WEI has a LinkedIn corporate page. We also, myself and I are very active on LinkedIn. And so if our customers have any questions, you can come to us and ask us. We're available to you at any time.